The morning my husband's business partner handed me a certified letter in the parking lot of my own company, he was smiling. That should have been my first signal. Men like Conrad Hess do not smile unless they've already calculated the exact weight of what they're dropping on you and decided they can afford to watch it land. I was holding 2 coffees and a laptop bag, standing in the November cold outside the building I had personally signed the lease on 4 years earlier, and Conrad was walking toward me from a silver sedan I didn't recognize, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. He'd driven 2 hours from Dallas to hand me a piece of paper he easily could have emailed. That alone told me everything I needed to know about what kind of moment this was supposed to be for him. I set both coffees on the hood of my Jeep. I took the envelope. I did not open it in front of him, and I watched something flicker in his face when I didn't. A brief, impatient disappointment. The look of a man who rehearsed an audience reaction and found the seat empty. "Thanks, Conrad," I said. "Have a safe drive back." And I picked up my coffees and went inside. The letter was a notice of intent to dissolve our partnership and a competing claim of primary ownership over the proprietary software platform we had spent 3 years building together. Or rather, that I had spent 3 years building, while Conrad spent those same 3 years at client dinners taking credit for the architecture I drafted alone in a rental house in Lubbock with bad heat and a secondhand monitors. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and the part you need to understand first isn't the letter. It's what was underneath it, what had been underneath it for a long time, and why Conrad had chosen this particular Tuesday in November to finally show his hand. Welcome to Quiet Storms, where we tell real stories about people who got knocked flat and got back up sideways. I'm your host. This one is about what happens when you build something from nothing and somebody decides they can take it because you were too busy building to watch the door. Stay with me. My name is Marlowe Voss, and I was 31 when I incorporated Fieldline Analytics out of the second bedroom of a house I was renting with 2 other women in Lubbock, Texas. I want to be honest about what that looked like. The desk was a door on sawhorses. I used a space heater I'd bought at a garage sale because the landlord kept the thermostat at 62, and I ate a lot of peanut butter crackers over a keyboard while writing code that I genuinely believed was going to change how small agricultural operations tracked soil data, because it was going to, and eventually it did. I had a master's degree in environmental data systems from Texas Tech, and 4 years of corporate experience I'd quit because the company I worked for had a very clear policy about whose ideas became whose patents, and it was not the policy that favored me. I left with nothing but the knowledge I arrived with and one clear conviction. The thing I was building existed in my head fully formed. I just needed time and hardware and the kind of stubborn solitude that is easier to maintain when you have no social life to speak of and nothing good on television. The idea was a platform that allowed small and mid-sized farms to aggregate yield, moisture, and input data in a single dashboard and actually use it. Not just collect it, use it. The market for agricultural analytics was dominated by tools built for large industrial operations but cost more per year than a small family farm grossed. I was going to build the affordable version, the one that made sense for the people who actually needed it. I worked on it alone for 14 months. I took consulting gigs on the side to pay rent, the kind of work where someone has a spreadsheet emergency and needs a data person on short notice, and I showed up and fixed it and went home and kept building. I did not tell anyone what I was building, which in retrospect was the smartest thing I did in that whole period, and also, in one specific instance, the habit I should have held onto longer. I met Conrad Hess at a regional ag tech conference in Amarillo. He was presenting on soil sensors, which is adjacent to what I was doing. He had slides and a polo shirt with a logo on it, and a stack of business cards and the particular energy of a man accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in any room he chose to enter. He was not the most knowledgeable person in that room. He knew more about hardware than I did. I knew more about everything else, and when we ended up at the same table at the conference dinner and started talking, that became apparent to both of us within about 20 minutes. He asked the right questions. I want to be fair to Conrad and say that because it matters for why I made the choice I made. He asked about my platform architecture in a way that told me he understood what I was describing, and then he said something that unlocked a door I'd been pushing on alone for over a year. "What you're describing needs a hardware integration layer," he said, "and hardware is what I do." He was right. It did, and he did. And so 6 months later, I had a business partner. Looking back, I can draw a fairly clean line between who we each were at the beginning of that partnership and who Conrad became once the platform started working. In the beginning, he was genuinely useful. He knew manufacturers I didn't. He had supplier contacts that cut our hardware costs significantly. He showed up to the early beta tests and took notes and caught integration problems I'd missed because I'd been too close to the code for too long. He was good at the things he was good at, and I was grateful for it, and I told him so, which is how I know the gratitude was real. But somewhere around year 2, once the first paying clients were renewing, once agricultural extension offices started asking about us, once a regional co-op signed a contract that was the largest we'd had by a factor of 4, something shifted in Conrad. It was gradual enough that I kept re-explaining it to myself as stress, as growing pains, as the way any partnership gets complicated when money gets real. I am good at giving people the benefit of the doubt. I had been good at it my entire life, and it had served me and cost me in approximately equal measure. He started describing the platform differently in client meetings. Small shifts. The way he'd say, "We engineered this," when what he meant was, "Marlowe coded this and I recommended a sensor brand." The way he'd answer technical questions he didn't know the answer to, and I'd have to correct him quietly afterward, in the car, not in the room, because I didn't want to embarrass him in front of clients. That was my mistake, a recurring one. Correcting him privately meant the public record stayed uncorrected. He hired a sales coordinator without consulting me, which violated the terms of our partnership agreement, which I had drafted myself and which Conrad had signed, and which I still had in a fireproof lockbox in my home office, along with every other document relevant to the company from day one. I flagged the hire. We argued. He said he was trying to grow the business, and I was being territorial. I said I was being contractual. We compromised, which meant I let it go, which meant Conrad filed it away as a data point about what I would and wouldn't hold a line on. The second hire without consultation came 8 months later. A different kind of compromise followed. I can see now that each compromise was a boundary he was mapping. Not because Conrad was some kind of strategic genius, but because people who take things do it incrementally, and the increments only feel small while they're happening. The certified letter in the parking lot was not the beginning of anything. It was the moment he decided the map was complete. What the letter claimed, specifically, was that Conrad had been the originating creative force behind Fieldline Analytics, that the core intellectual property of the platform had emerged from his conceptual framework, and that my role had been primarily technical execution of his vision. It was a breathtaking document. I read it twice at my desk with the 2 coffees going cold beside me and felt something I had never quite felt before, which was the specific fury of watching someone describe your own mind back to you incorrectly in legal language. The letter was a prelude to a filing, his attorney's attempt to establish a narrative before any judge could see the actual timeline, because the timeline, the real one, with dates and version logs and email chains and lease agreements in my name alone, told a very different story. But Conrad had gambled that I didn't have the documentation to prove it, or that I wouldn't want the cost of a legal fight, or possibly both. He was wrong on both counts, and he had been wrong about Lee for a while without knowing it, which is something I am still working out the ethics of, because I had known this was coming for longer than he realized, and I had been preparing without telling him, and I'm not entirely sure yet how I feel about the version of myself who did that. So let me tell you about the 6 months before the parking lot. I should tell you that I am not a suspicious person by nature. I prefer evidence to intuition, probably because I've spent most of my adult life in data systems, and I've seen what happens when people mistake pattern recognition for proof. But there are moments when intuition is just pattern recognition running faster than you can articulate, and the thing that started it for me was a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Last April, late evening in the office, which was just 4 rooms above a farm supply store in a small town outside Lubbock, the arrangement I'd negotiated because the rent was reasonable and our clients found it reassuring to sign contracts somewhere that smelled faintly of fertilizer and purpose. Conrad thought we should have been in a glass building in Austin. I thought we should be close to the people we actually served, and I'd been right, and he'd resented it quietly for 2 years. I had gone back in after dinner to fix a server sync issue that had been nagging me. Conrad's car was in the lot, which surprised me. I thought he'd left. The outer office was dark. His door was half open and the light was on, and he was on the phone, speaking in the careful, lowered register of a man who knows someone is theoretically within earshot and has decided to calculate the odds and proceed. I didn't mean to stop. I stopped. He was talking to someone, a lawyer, I realized from the fragments, walking through some kind of valuation question. I heard the word platform twice, I heard the phrase originating party once, and then I heard him say, in the tone of a man closing a chapter he'd already written, "She doesn't know what I've been documenting." I stood in the dark odor office for approximately 30 seconds. Then I went very quietly back down the stairs and got in my car and sat in the parking lot and did the thing that has saved me more than once in this life, which is that I did not react. I felt the reaction, the whole boiling wave of it, and I sat with it and let it pass through me without letting it out, because I understood with absolute clarity that my reaction, if observed, was now a liability. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table, and I made a list. The thing about building a company from zero is that you document everything, not because you're strategic about it, but because you have to be. When you're a one-person operation, filing for incorporation and writing partnership agreements and registering intellectual property with a credit card you're not entirely sure has room on it, you keep records because records are how you survive. I had 4 years of records. Source code repositories with timestamps, email threads going back to the night I first described the platform to Conrad at that conference dinner, and he responded with questions that proved he hadn't understood it fully yet. Partnership agreement drafts in both our names, early investor decks with my byline and Conrad's name conspicuously absent from the technical sections because he had not wanted to answer technical questions he didn't know the answers to. The records existed. What I needed was someone to help me organize them into something that would hold up outside my own fireproof lockbox. There is a woman named Theodora Kim who practices intellectual property law out of Lubbock and who is approximately 5 feet tall and has the courtroom presence of a weather event. I had met her once on a panel on small business protections for women in agriculture, and she had said one thing that I'd written on an index card and kept on my desk for 2 years. The person who controls the documented timeline controls the story. I called her the morning after the parking lot conversation, not after the certified letter, 7 months before the certified letter. I told her what I'd heard, I told her what I suspected, and I laid out every piece of documentation I had, which took 2 hours on the phone and resulted in her saying at the end of it, in the precise, unhurried tone of someone delivering a favorable test result, "You built this. Every record says so. The question is whether we can get to the right venue before he files in the wrong one." We could, and we did, but not in the way you might expect. Because here's the thing I haven't told you yet. The thing that changed the shape of everything, that turned what Conrad thought was a story about a business dispute into something much larger and older and more complicated than a parking lot ambush. 3 weeks after I called Theodora, while she was cataloging my documentation, and I was trying to behave like a woman who hadn't heard the word documenting said about her in a dark hallway, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, with a 512 area code, Austin. I almost didn't answer. I almost never answer unknown numbers. I answered. The woman on the other end said her name was Gloria Reyes, and she said it carefully, the way people say names they're not sure will land, watching for a reaction they can't quite predict. She said she was a paralegal at an IP litigation firm in Austin, and she said she was calling because a client of theirs had retained them to document a claim that Fieldline Analytics' core platform architecture had been derived from proprietary research conducted at a private agricultural technology startup that had dissolved 4 years earlier in Austin, Texas. I sat down on my kitchen floor, not because my legs gave out, because I needed to be low to the ground for what was coming next. The startup was called Betrayal Systems, she said. It had operated for 18 months before losing its primary investor. Its founding technical researcher had been a woman named Dr. Carla Voss. My mother, she said, and then she paused, had she mentioned that this call might be personal. My mother had died when I was 22. A car accident, a winter road, a curve she knew well, and black ice she didn't see. I had been in my junior year of college. I had driven home and handled everything and gone back to finish my degree because she had told me, in the specific way she said the things she meant most, that finishing was the only tribute she'd accept. What I had never known, what no one had told me, what apparently had existed in a filing cabinet in Austin, in the records of a dissolved company, was that before she died, my mother had spent nearly 2 years developing a framework for exactly the kind of platform I had later built. Not the same code, not the same implementation, but the same conceptual architecture. The data aggregation approach I had believed I'd invented, the specific way the dashboard mapped inputs to projections, the logic structure underneath the whole thing. I had not invented it. I had remembered it. I had been 12 years old when my mother was working on Betrayal Systems. I had sat in her home office after school doing homework while she coded. I had listened to her explain what she was building in the half-absent way adults explain things to children they assume aren't fully absorbing it. The way you talk to a smart kid when you're thinking out loud and they happen to be in the room. I had absorbed all of it. And then she had died, and I had gone to college, and 10 years later, I had sat down in a rental house in Lubbock and built the thing my nervous system already knew how to build without understanding where the knowledge had come from. Gloria told me that the firm had been retained by a man named Desmond Hale, who had been Betrayal's original investor and who had retained the company's IP after it dissolved. He was claiming that Fieldline Analytics had violated that IP. He had hired attorneys. He had documentation. I said, very quietly, that I would need to call her back. Then I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time. Here is what I know about grief that has been sitting in a drawer for 9 years. It does not go away. It metabolizes. It becomes something you carry without feeling the weight of it until someone opens the drawer, and then it is suddenly the only thing in the room. I had built my mother's life's work without knowing it. I had spent 4 years defending it from a man who wanted to steal it without knowing what I was actually defending. And now a stranger was calling to tell me the IP belonged to someone else, except this someone else was dead, and I was her daughter. And what exactly was supposed to happen next was not a question any filing cabinet in Austin could answer. I called Theodora. She said, "Marlowe, take a breath." Then she said, "Call the Austin firm back and find out who Desmond Hale actually is." Desmond Hale, as it turned out, was a man who had invested $60,000 in Betrayal Systems in 2008 and had watched it dissolved 16 months later when his own financial troubles made continued funding impossible. He had retained the IP because no one had contested it at the time, and it had sat in his records for over a decade, presumably worth nothing, until a business associate of his who followed agricultural technology had read a profile of Fieldline Analytics in a regional trade publication and noticed something familiar in the architecture description. His claim was legally coherent. It was also something I could not immediately disprove, which was terrifying, and which was also the moment that Conrad's letter in the parking lot 7 months later finally made complete sense. Conrad knew. He had found out about Desmond Hale's brewing claim before I had. I still do not know how, whether he'd heard something at a conference, whether he had contacts in the Austin legal world, whether he'd simply been doing the kind of opposition research that men like Conrad do when they start planning an exit strategy. But Conrad had known that a cloud was forming over the platform's IP, and rather than tell me, rather than bring it to his business partners so we could address it together, he had decided to use it. He had been preparing his own claim on the platform, positioning himself as the originating visionary, so that when Desmond Hale's challenge surfaced publicly, Conrad could argue he was the legitimate owner and negotiate separately. He was planning to step over me, absorb the platform, and deal with Hale on his own terms, cutting me out entirely while using the legal noise as cover. The certified letter in the parking lot was Conrad jumping early because Theodora and I had filed a declaratory action, which I will explain in a moment, and he'd felt the ground shift. But none of that is what saved me. What saved me happened in a conference room in Austin on a Tuesday in October, 5 weeks before Conrad handed me that envelope, when I sat across a table from Desmond Hale for the first time. He was 73 years old. He had kind eyes and bad hearing in his left ear, and a firm handshake. He had a folder in front of him and his attorney beside him, and an expression I could not read. And then Theodora slid a single document across the conference room table, and his attorney picked it up, and Desmond Hale looked at it over the attorney's shoulder and went very still. It was my mother's photograph. Theodora had found it in Teraline's original incorporation documents. Desmond Hale looked at the photograph for a long moment, and then he looked at me. "You're Carla's daughter," he said, not a question. "Yes, sir," I said. He sat back, he took off his glasses, he did the thing people do when they're reorganizing their understanding of a room in real time. He said very quietly that my mother had been the best technical mind he'd ever invested in. He said he'd never stopped being sorry the funding had run out. He said he hadn't known she had died. I watched him receive that information, watched it travel across his face, and I knew, with the same pattern recognition that had stopped me cold in that dark hallway 7 months earlier, that Desmond Hale did not drive this claim with malice. He drove it with the specific grievance of an old man watching something he believed in go unacknowledged, not understanding that the woman building it had come by the knowledge honestly, the most honest way possible. I told him about sitting in her office as a child. I told him about the homework on the floor beside her chair. I told him I had not known, could not have known, what I was remembering when I built it. I told him that if he had a claim to anything, it was to her work, and that I was her heir in ways no filing cabinet had captured. The room was quiet for a while. Then Desmond Hale said he needed a few minutes with his attorney. Theodora and I went to the hallway. She got us both water from a cooler by the elevator, and she said, in the specific way she said things when she was being careful, that whatever happened next, I had behaved with more grace than the situation required. I said I wasn't being gracious, I was being accurate. What happened next took 3 more weeks to formalize and is not simple to explain in linear terms, but I will do my best, because it matters. Desmond Hale dropped his claim. He did not do it silently. He executed an assignment of whatever rights he held in Teraline's original IP, assigning them not to me personally, but to a foundation he established in my mother's name, a small fund for women in agricultural technology research, which he seeded from his own resources and which named me as an advisory board member. He had been holding on to the IP for 15 years, he told Theodora afterward, because he hadn't known what to do with it, and it had felt wrong to let it disappear. He just needed somewhere to put it that honored her. And I, who had built my entire professional life out of something I didn't know I'd inherited, suddenly understood what I'd been building for in a way I hadn't before. The Conrad situation resolved with considerably less elegance and considerably more paperwork. With Desmond's claim withdrawn and the timeline documentation Theodora had assembled, the declaratory action we'd filed was straightforward. Fieldline Analytics IP was documented to its origin. Its origin was me. The partnership agreement Conrad had signed clearly delineated contributions and assigned IP ownership to the founding technical partner, which was also me. His claim of originating creative force was not supported by a single time-stamped record, because you cannot originate something you started documenting after it already existed. His attorney made one serious push, arguing that Conrad's hardware integration work had been so central to the platform's market viability that his contribution warranted a creative ownership stake. Theodora was polite about dismantling it. She had a gift for being polite while doing that. The settlement Conrad accepted dissolved our partnership. He retained his hardware supplier relationships. He received a payment for his tangible contributions to the company's infrastructure that was fair and that he knew was fair, and that he took in the careful silence of a man who has finished calculating and doesn't like the answer. He signed a non-disparagement agreement. He kept his client contacts in the sectors where his hardware relationships had generated the business. He got, in other words, exactly what his actual contributions were worth, not what his ambition had reached for, what he had actually done. I want to tell you something honest about that settlement meeting because I think it matters. Conrad sat across the table from me and Theodora, and at one point he looked at me and started to say something and stopped. He started again and stopped again, and then he just looked down at the table. I don't know what he was going to say. I have thought about it. The most generous interpretation is that he was going to apologize. The least generous is that he was going to try one last reframing. I'll never know which it was, because I didn't ask him to finish. I said, "I hope the next thing you build is actually yours." Then I looked at Theodora, and we moved to the next page. What I built after Conrad was different in ways I'm still understanding. Not the platform, which continued and grew and eventually served over 400 small farming operations across 3 states, but me, the person running the company. I had spent 4 years being a founder who was also, underneath everything, a woman waiting for something to prove she'd earned the right to be in the room she'd built, waiting for the moment the imposter feeling would stop, working harder than I needed to because something in me believed that visible output was the only protection against the idea that I didn't quite belong at the table I'd set. Conrad's gamble had failed. Desmond Hale had become, improbably, someone I consider a kind of ally, and my mother, who had died when I was 22, had turned out to have been quietly building toward everything I was trying to build. Not as a mystical thing, not as a sign, just as the plainest possible evidence that I had come by this honestly. After the settlement, I went back to my office above the farm supply store and I sat at my desk and I pulled up the earliest source file in the Fieldline repository, version 0.1, dated 3 years and 8 months ago. My name in the commit log, which is an automated record no one can alter after the fact. I read through the original architecture for a while, the thing I had believed I'd invented. I thought about a woman in a home office in Austin explaining things to a 12-year-old she assumed wasn't fully absorbing it. I thought about the homework on the floor. I thought about how a child's brain takes in everything, files it somewhere below articulation, and then, 15 years later, a woman sits down at a door on sawhorses in Lubbock, Texas, and reaches for something she doesn't know she already has. You cannot steal from someone what they've already built into themselves. That's the thing Conrad didn't understand. That's what his certified letter couldn't touch. I called Theodora after the settlement closed and thanked her for everything. She said, "You did the work. I just organized the evidence." Then she said something I've kept with me, the way I kept that index card on my desk for 2 years. She said, "Marlowe, your mother built the foundation and you built the house. No one gets to take either." I cried in my car in the parking lot above the farm supply store. The particular kind of crying isn't sadness exactly, just the release valve finally opening after pressure has been building in a sealed system for longer than you realized. Then I went back upstairs, sat at my desk, and opened the dashboard. There were 6 new farms requesting onboarding. I started with the first one. Fieldline Analytics is still operating. I still run it. We've grown to a team of 11, and I let people ask me questions in meetings now instead of pre-answering them, which turns out to be the thing I needed to unlearn most. Desmond Hale sends me a note twice a year, once at the Foundation's anniversary and once at the New Year. They are short, careful notes from a man who is old enough to know that some things only get said if you say them on purpose. He said in last year's note that my mother would have found the platform's growth satisfying. He said satisfying, not proud. I think he knew her well enough to get that right. I have a photograph of her on my desk now, not displayed dramatically, just there, the way things are when they belong somewhere. And the index card is still there too, moved from the desk of a woman with a door on sawhorses to the desk of a woman who owns the room. The person who controls the documented timeline controls the story. She did. I do. And no certified letter delivered in a parking lot by a man who drove 2 hours to watch it land is ever going to change that. If you've ever built something from the ground up and had someone try to take credit for your foundation, drop a comment below. Subscribe if you want more stories about the people who document everything and wait, because the wait is the hardest part and the most important one. I'll see you in the next story.